I learned long ago that people show you who they are in small, public moments. Sometimes those moments are subtle, a glance, a laugh, a phrase said in passing. Sometimes they are loud and theatrical, the kind you stage when you want the whole room to take sides. The night of Clara's 30th birthday was one of those theatrical moments. It was polished, rehearsed, and intended to humiliate me in the most elegant way possible. My name is Ryan. I plan campaigns for a living, political campaigns, corporate narratives, hard-fought messaging wars. My job is to take messy, stubborn truth and shape it into something that wins hearts, headlines, and votes. I don't get sentimental about optics. I measure things, timing, leverage, narrative arcs. Until that night, I treated my relationship with Clara as a simple, mutually beneficial arrangement. She had charm, beauty, and the kind of effusive social life I wasn't built for. I offered stability, space, and a quiet life in the background while I recharged between election seasons. We had an honest conversation at the start. Nothing permanent, no pressure. She agreed. She also began to think the arrangement was a promotion. Her birthday party was a production, vintage Hollywood theme. She'd spent months planning it. Sequin gowns, a rented grand piano, and a guest list full of flattering faces. The room hummed with music and clinking crystal. I was there maintaining the invisible infrastructure, ensuring the catering ran smoothly. The champagne kept flowing, and the photographer framed every flattering angle. It was a useful role. I kept the show running, precisely the way I keep a campaign machine functioning. But the show was not mine. Then the toast. Clara stood before a sea of polite friends and acquaintances. Maya, her best friend, was beside her, always looking at me like she'd rather be anywhere else. Clara's voice was bright, practiced. She thanked this person, that person, praise for parents, a nod to a few close friends. She scanned the room like an actress searching for an ideal reaction shot, and then she landed on a man who had been her standard for years, Julian. He was there, impeccably dressed, giving the small bow of a man whose life is curated for public consumption. "And I have to give a special thank you to my amazing friend Julian," she said, with the sort of sincerity actors practice. "My ex, yes, but also the man who taught me what I deserve." He raised the bar for me. The room erupted. Applause. Whistles. Julian took a gracious bow like a man being thanked in an award show. And then, because she wanted the punchline, she looked at me, not by name, not by sentiment. She offered a casual little wave toward the bar where I'd been standing and said, and thanks to him, too, I guess, the words intentionally small, a dismissive footnote. It was surgical. Her message was clear. Julian was the standard. I was the placeholder. She'd put me on stage long enough for the lighting, and then reduced me to background noise. A few titters rolled through the crowd, the kind of laughter that feels like knives. People who clap when you're supposed to be humiliated without lifting a finger. I didn't yell. I didn't storm out. I took a slow sip of my drink. The expression on my face didn't change. The collapse that began inside me was quiet but total. For a campaign operative, humiliation isn't personal in the way it is for casual hearts. It's a data point, a risk assessment. In that little wave and the room's reaction, Clara had done what opposition research does. She defined my narrative in public. She had decided what the story about me should be. My brain switched modes. The man who writes strategy for a living is not quick to react with fury. He plans moves that are carefully timed and surgically executed. It's not personal theater. It's politics. For the next 48 hours, I became my own opposition research team. I started with the ledger, not out of spite at first, more out of the necessity of truth. For 8 months, I've been the quiet bankroll in Clara's life. I cataloged every indulgence she'd enjoyed, the designer pieces I bought, the weekend hotel trips I paid for, the dinner tabs and spa days. I mapped the ecosystem. Clara, Julian, Maya, the charity gala where her name sat on letterhead, and the small world of fundraisers and glossy magazine columns she orbitated within. Then I shifted my attention to Julian. He lived in the pale sunlight of a glossy Instagram. Vintage car, entrepreneur, founder, hustle, effortless success. But successful narratives are easy to embellish. I hired a discreet digital forensics contractor I use occasionally in campaign work. I wanted facts, financial, legal, public records, nothing illegal, just real data. What he pulled up was more convenient than I expected. Julian's tech company, Innovalite, was smoke and mirrors. Little revenue, heavy loans. Wealthy father funding the lifestyle. The vintage car? Leased. The founder stories? Recycled social capital funded by family accounts. That shiny image had a structural weakness underneath it. Dependency. Campaign managers don't just collect dirt. They sculpt a narrative that's digestible and repeatable for the specific community you want to reach. I wasn't launching into the global media stage. I wanted the small, insular world that sustained Clara and Julian, investors, gala organizers, and the boutique of friends who fed gossip. Those were the audiences whose reaction would bleed inward, not outward. My first move was surgical and cold in its elegance. There was a charity gala where Clara's name sat pretty on the committee roster. She never earned that mention. It was a vanity line on her resume of curated elegance, but she loved to display my donations as evidence of my generosity and her social value. I called the gala's organizational head. I framed it as a portfolio restructuring. I'd need to withdraw the donation. The language sounded like a business decision. I pledged plausible regret and said it was the right financial strategy for firm. The committee head called Clara. She was shocked before she was furious. Ryan pulled the donation. The head said, "We're going to have to adjust the program." That sentence was a grenade I'd lobbed into Clara's social currency. Reputation is fragile in that world. Once a donation disappears, so does a certain kind of confidence. Clara confronted me that evening, breathless and frantic. I gave a measured answer. Market unrest, reallocating commitments. Business language is surgical when delivered dry. She heard punishment and humiliation. She heard a betrayal of her social standing. And that was the point. While Clara reeled, my contractor surfaced a rest about Julian. Innovalite had been propped up by a handful of investors, with no scalable product and a burn rate that looked like a startup manic episode. There were lead investors who believed the story, and once the belief cracked, so did the funding. Moreover, records showed payment postponements for Julian's lease car. It was not the kind of vulnerability you brag about in a gala speech. The next phase, anonymous narrative placement. I drafted a sober due diligence memo on Innovalite. No accusations, only facts framed for a particular audience. Lead investors, a local business reporter known for exposing Silicon Valley vanity, and Julian's primary benefactor, his father. The memo landed in the exact inboxes whose decisions would collapse the house of cards. I wasn't seeking a viral scandal so much as directed attrition, a withering of the small trusts that upheld their world. Simultaneously, I targeted Maya. She worked at an upscale boutique where employee perks and after-hours borrowing was rife. She helped Clara cure outfits, often returning them, sometimes abusing the system. I reported a pattern to loss prevention in a calm, procedural message. Review returns from specific staffers for anomalies. It was the kind of tip that would trigger audit and inventory leads. Once the audit ran, the housekeeping of Maya's return fraud became a corporate problem, not a social secret. Days became a sequence of small detonations. A business reporter published a careful, merciless piece about Innovalite's financials and lack of product-market fit. Investors asked for transparency. Funding froze. Julian's father quietly stepped back. Julian, once an image of privileged certainty, found his sources of leverage evaporating. Meanwhile, the boutique's audit flagged patterns implicating Maya. HR interviews were scheduled, and then the boutique's public statement appeared. We take fraud seriously. Maya was placed on leave pending investigation. Clara's world contracted. The charity committee began to scramble. The gala program had to be reworked. Social invitations I thought were secure began to look tenuous. She called me in a panic. She wanted explanations, apologies. Her voice was high and shaky in a way I hadn't heard when she'd been triumphant at the podium. There's a peculiar feeling to watching someone who once wielded influence as an effortless weapon suddenly scramble to preserve the trappings of status. She had loved the applause. When the applause turned into questions and audits, She did not recognize how fragile her castle had been. Nowhere did I play the vengeful figure in a melodramatic sense. I didn't throw a tantrum or post a scathing video. Instead, I used the tools of my trade: discreet research, targeted dissemination, and narrative framing. The story that emerged in our corner of the world was cleaner than any fight. Intervalite's investors were fed a fact-based memo. The boutique's loss prevention followed its protocol. The gala committee had to be practical. Rumors became reporting. Reporting became consequences. A week into the campaign, Julian called Clara. He told her he had to focus on his own pressing issues. Investors were nervous. The company needed attention. He distanced himself like a man reclaiming a reputation in freefall. Maya got fired and sought legal counsel. Clara's name appeared in internal interviews. People she considered friends began to make excuses about attending other events. The initial cluster of allies dissipated like smoke. She came to me after the reporter's piece ran. She sat on my couch, mascara streaking, voice small. "I don't understand what happened. I thought I had everything," she said, bewildered. She thought she'd been the center of consolation, but what she'd built was a fragile arrangement sustained by other people's faith and her own performance. I listened, let her explain. She wanted me to take her back, to make it right. The man who organizes winning campaigns recognized the tragic arc of a candidate who had run a poor strategy, inconsistent messaging, unreliable supporters, and a platform propped up by posture rather than substance. "You made a strategic error," I said softly. "You aimed for optics instead of stability. You chose a loud crowd over fundamentals." When the realization dawned in her face that this had been a campaign and she'd run it badly, and worse, that I'd been the opposing campaign manager who exploited those errors, the humiliation was different now. It was not the shallow clap at the podium. It was a slow collapse of the ecosystem she depended upon. The final scene played out without melodrama. I packed a box of her things for her and set it near the door. Our arrangement had been a contract, and all contracts have termination clauses. "Our contract is expired," I said. "It's time for you to stand on your own." She left. She returned to her parents' home. Julian faced lawsuits and investor fallout. Maya battled to salvage her professional reputation. The boutique publicly announced reforms. The gala had to find new donors. I gave a short, off-the-record interview to the local reporter, framed as a perspective of a private man who had simply noticed some troubling inconsistencies in a glossy world and chosen not to be complicit in illusions. The piece painted me as measured and pragmatic, exactly the narrative I needed. When she came to my door 2 days later begging to come back, she finally understood the lesson. "You did all of this?" she whispered, fear and recognition colliding. I didn't boast. I told her what I tell campaign interns. You win by identifying an opponent's narrative and replacing it with one people will accept. She had attempted to define me with a single diminutive sentence at a toast. I'd treated it like an opening argument. She'd been the candidate. I'd been the opposition. And the election was over. I closed the door. I have no joy in watching a person's life implode. But in the world I inhabit, you survive by recognizing when a narrative turns into a threat. I moved my life forward because the stakes were my safety, my reputation, my sanity. In politics, you learn to measure damage and neutralize it before it metastasizes. I applied that doctrine to my private life. Months later, word filtered through. She was working at a modest job. Julian was embroiled in suits. Maya had changed cities. The social circle that once orbited the bright, hollow center of Clara's life had dispersed. For me, the ending was cleaner than a headline could capture. A quiet apartment, a new morning routine, and the steady hum of work that had always defined me. For Clara, the consequences were real and heavy. For me, the lesson was still the same. Never let someone else write your narrative without the right to reply. When people ask if I regret it, the answer is simple. I don't regret protecting the things I built, the reputation I earned, or the life I choose to lead. In the elegant cruelty of that birthday toast, she exposed the very thing she thought she was owed. I responded not with spectacle, but with the tools I knew best. It wasn't malicious theater. It was a campaign to preserve the life I had worked to construct. And the quiet satisfaction of winning comes not from humiliation delivered, but from the calm of order restored. The room that celebrated her that night now exists somewhere else, filled perhaps with new faces, new scripts. People will clap, whistles will sound, and hands will wave again for different reasons. But in the small, decisive moments, the wave of a hand at a toast, the sarcastic aside meant to puncture a partner's identity. People reveal their strategy. Watch closely. Record the data. Because sometimes the small performance is a declaration of war, and the right response is not noise, but the methodical construction of a better story.